All right, hello and welcome. This recording, I'm going to go over a few of the common pitfalls that I've had with students the past few semesters. Again, I can kind of tell the reason why people have had trouble with this. Again, the vast majority of people who have utilized the resources I've provided have done well on this, so this may not be really absolutely necessary, because if you've watched the other recordings, you probably would do okay. But again, just in case, or in case some of the people who normally don't watch those are participating and are still having some of the same issues, I would like to prevent those. Okay, so what I'm going to do is pull up our rubric. And you should be able to see that now. If you are looking here, you see that the categories on the left are criteria, pretty much match exactly what is in the bullet points that I give you on your study guide for a reason. And literally, that's what I think I said in the first recording is there's no surprises here. You get the exact same prompt, and everything that I have in there is exactly what you need to prepare for. So this matches exactly with what you have had as far as the bullet points in that written version, and which I went over in the other recording. You see the F range is on the left, and it progresses up to the A range, right? And the common errors that we have here, all right, number one, before we go into this, is brevity, all right? And I will get some people who will turn in something that's like about 3 paragraphs long and will fail miserably. They'll get something like a 10 on it, and then they ask me why. And I'm like, you summed up everything you've learned in half of a college level class in about 12 sentences. Why would you expect anything more than that? This should be a detailed response demonstrating everything that you know and understand on the topics. And it covers, as I said, every single chapter that we do in the first half of the class. So you should have, again, an average passing response is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 or 6 pages. But to be honest, my C and my A range responses are not necessarily very different in terms of how long they are. I would say the A ranges are probably going to tend to be about 6 pages, but so are some of my C ranges. What is going to be different is what you discuss in that amount of space. So here's a few things. So when you look, first of all, the government branches, what you want to focus on here is those things that are not legislative in nature, right, that Congress has some influence over. So their ability to review treaties, at least for the Senate, right? Their ability to confirm appointments, secretaries in the president's administration, and judicial appointments are actually checks and balances where, in the case of appointing secretaries, that's something, the president's hiring these people, so that's an executive power that they're taking. And of course, appointing the judges, that's judicial, right? Which is shared with the president. So that's one that actually hits on 2 of those at the same time, right? The one on the treaty hits on this one, and then the next category, which is the checks and balances between House and Senate, right? Where to find these? Number one, if you watch the first video, I give you a bunch of them there, enough to get to a C range. Literally, if you watch the first recording and you write down what I say about those, I give you enough to get to the C range. So go to the Constitution to get a few more and get into the A and B range and explain why you think that is given there. So why do we give that power to appoint judges to the president and then share it with the Senate? That might get you to the C range again, because it's one of the ones I mentioned in that recording. But explain to me, what is the logic of that? You want to check and balance, so think, why would we give that maybe not to the House? Why would we give it to the Senate instead of the House, right? I'm not giving you those. explain it. I don't care. The worst you can do is come up with something wrong, which is the same as not doing it. So give a stab at it. What I'm looking at is your thought process and that you show some understanding and some logic and, just this is higher critical thinking skills. All right. So you have to demonstrate those. You have to think. You don't know. You have to think. All right. And explain based off of that. All right. And it's basically the same thing with the checks between the House and the Senate. Go to the Constitution. To get in the A range, you start explaining why you think those were set up the way they were. All right. Constitution and enumeration. This is where we start getting into one issue. Again, if you look, you get into some discussion of the elastic clause and the supremacy clause as it relates to the topic. When you look at the part right under the B range, it's kind of broken, but if you look at the top of the next page, elastic clause or supremacy clause as it relates to this topic. So what you want to talk about is this concept of enumeration, how spelling out the powers actually is a limiting factor. Then you come back and you have to tell me about the elastic clause and how that is used to expand the powers of Congress beyond what's on the list, right? And the supremacy clause, of course, how it becomes a supreme law of the land. I noticed in some of the discussions, a lot of people basically came to the conclusion that Congress can do anything they want to because of that elastic clause, and that's not the case. You have to remember that the whole goal here is to limit what the government to do. So it does not do that. You can stretch powers, but they have to relate to the ones you have. You can't just go out and make murder a crime, and the federal government doesn't do that. You can make it a crime on federal property, for example, or the military, things where you have been given power to do that. It doesn't say in the Constitution you can make murder a crime, period. But for you to have the power to make laws for the military, you have to be able to make murder on a military base a crime. All right. But just throwing the words out has been the most common thing. People get this part of it and they will go in and just throw the words elastic clause or supremacy clause in there. All that tells me is the two words, supremacy clause or elastic clause. All right, those two words go together, and that's all you tell me about. That does not show me that you understand how it relates to the topic at all. So you need to put explanation in there. It does not have to be 5 pages of explanation. This is something that you could do probably in about 2 sentences, right? To get into that A and B range also, that analysis, where do you get that? You have to show me you've read not just the textbook, but everything assigned. So you get that from the discussions that we had, all right, and the documents that they were based on, all right? You go to the Bank of the United States and look at Hamilton and Jefferson's opinions, and you include your own thoughts on that. You do not side with Hamilton, neither do you side with Jefferson. You look at it and see what it means to yourself and explain where you think those limits are, right? And that is pretty much through all of our documents. You will see several things here. When you talk about federalism, all right, skipping down to when it's at the bottom of this rubric page, right? Not the full bottom, but the last one that's completely on this page. Prince versus the United States. To get in that A range, you have to talk about Prince versus United States. I said talk about it. I did not say put the name Prince versus United States and say something like, about how our federalism works and then explain and say as demonstrated by Prince versus U.S. That doesn't even show me you read the case. That just shows me you read the title. Include how this works. That's a very detailed discussion that goes into stuff the textbooks doesn't go that deep into. So you need to talk about how, for example, yes, the federal law is supreme law of the land, but if a state disagrees with it, you cannot force the state to enforce it for you. That is some advanced discussion. That is every case that you have. If you look at Chaplinsky, we have, again, this category on non-governmental entities, the very last one. That covers 2 of those. You got this whole concept of the Bill of Rights and the people's ability to stop the government, right? That is First Amendment, right? It also, of course, it's a press right, so it relates to the press and how, the press is able to act as the watchdog on what the government does, right? Dothard, that case was on equality, and of course that is something that you can bring up in that range, but you also want to look at that in deeper context than what you had. Show me just on the Dothard case, and there does nothing if you put the name. You have to tell me how it relates to it and what it demonstrates as far as checking the federal government's powers, right? Not just saying that it does it and putting the name on there. That's nothing, right? You have to explain to me how that shows in that case. That one is one that you've got to be careful with now. Right, that's a limitation on state power, not really federal power. So it's not really one that you want to focus on. It's going to be one that comes up more on the final exam. All right. So as you look at these, that's basically what the biggest things right there. Number one, don't give me short stuff. All right. Don't fill it with a bunch of big language. 5 pages of, in fact, if you do 20 pages of language, it does not really tell me that you've read the textbook. It's still an F. You have to use the information. Be very short, concise. Like I say, you don't need to write a book about how the press affects and impacts government. You need to write a paragraph, but you need to put a lot of the information in that paragraph. So don't put a lot of flowery language. You do not need a single fluff piece here. You don't need technically, if you look at this is the rubric. There's nothing in here about a thesis, an introduction. You get right into the discussion. Skip an introduction, no conclusion, right to the rubric. All right. Non-governmental entities is the other one that's a problem for many people. Like I said, this exam tests every single chapter. Now, what I put in the discussion and in the study guide was, for example, the press. And what I get many times is that is the only thing people put in there. All right. We have a chapter on federalism, the Constitution. Those cover, to a large extent, the first 2, right? 3, and the fifth, 3, 4, the 5th one, federalism. Right? The people, we have an entire chapter on voting. It is not sufficient to just say that people have the power to kick out their representatives if they don't do what they want. You have an entire chapter devoted to how the people participate in the system. Before that, there's a reason the chapter on political socialization comes in before that, because how you vote and how you participate in other ways is shaped by your socialization. So you want to bring that in to some extent and talk about that chapter on socialization. If you mention voting, you notice that the D range is a few means of participation. So that means if all you talk about is voting, you are in the F range because one is not a few, right? Talk about protests, economic boycotts. Yes, voting is a major part and the number one thing that comes to mind. Participation by joining political parties and special interest groups are all mentioned in that chapter and discussed. So you need to also bring those in. It acts how the people act as a check and balance, and that is far beyond just voting, which should be evident. Research paper topics, a lot of times several were asking questions about the protests on college campuses related to Gaza, right? So how you could pick that as a topic and then completely miss this on this part of the, rubric when you hit it, just shouldn't happen. All right. If your whole research paper is on that, then you should definitely be bringing in that into the discussion. Many of those were also protests trying to get the colleges, and many of those are state colleges, to divest or pull out money from companies based or supporting Israel. That's your economic boycott right there. So that's one also that you shouldn't miss if that particular protesting line is something that you're focusing on. All right. Be thorough and show me you have read the entire chapter on all of these, right? The non-governmental entities relates to this. And, if you organize this, you might want those paragraphs to flow together, because when you talk about the press, it's important because of 2 things. Number one, it, brings issues from the people to the government, but it also tells the people what the government is or is not doing, right? And those are things that change the people's views. So those work hand in hand. If you know what the government's doing, it might change your vote. If you don't know what the government's doing, you're less likely perhaps to vote at all. And, if you don't know what the president's doing and you just have to believe what they say instead of what is being reported in the press, it might lead you to vote for someone. When you look at what they're actually doing, you would line up on the other side. The political socialization, the press is actually mentioned in that. It's one of the last things, but it relates to that as well. Those two chapters tie together. So you should really talk about those things kind of holistically, if you will. Everything, these civil rights, all right, those are ways that the people check and balance the federal government. How do you do that? Well, obviously, you can talk about how the First Amendment protects and keeps your ability to practice your religion, speak how you want. Of course, the press provision you might talk about in relation to that part on the press. But your government can't just throw you in jail because you disagree with you. And if they do throw you in jail, they have to give you a due process of law of some type, including, which specifically is spelled out, a jury trial, right to representation, all of that. Right? How do you enforce those? Usually by suing the government when they are rights that are denied to you. But those things are all in this, and it kind of ties those together. So you can almost look at this chapter on the people and this chapter on non-governmental entities as almost one rubric item that's subdivided into two separate categories, subcategories, however you want to term it, and hit those together because those are very much locked in together. The federalism, kind of the same thing. When you talk about Constitution and enumeration, those two kind of do work together because when we talk about the elastic clause and whether we expand or contract the powers of the federal government, there's three players in this, and people focus on, and the textbook really focuses on two of them. If you take power away from the federal government, the general consensus is that it's going to go to the states. All right. In other words, if you don't give the power to regulate murder as a crime to the federal government, it goes to the states. They can do it. It doesn't mean it doesn't get done. It means that's the state's province, not the federal government's. If you were to expand that power so the government could do it at the federal level, you take it away from the states. But there is a third player in here that we often forget because sometimes you take power away from the federal government and it does not go to the state, it goes to the people, right? And that is where our First Amendment and our chapter on equality, all of those things, that's where they come in. Your system of rights, whether we're talking about your individual liberties, right? The Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, Fourth Amendment, can't break into your house without a search warrant. But this is also where you get the state governments balanced out with those ideas of equality. Again, this is focused on the government, but as you look at the concept of federalism, you do want to show that demonstration. That's where you put that in. And you might work the Dothard case in there. You don't really have to on this one because it's what I really want you to see is that you read the chapter on equality. So you want to discuss that in the context of federalism. So you don't have to delve into that one as deeply as the other things, but you do want to show me that you've read the chapter, right? With that, any questions, feel free to send them to me, all right? If you are working on this and you have, written a paragraph or two, maybe you've addressed the first one, you can ask me, take a look at it. Can you look at this and tell me, am I on the right track? I'm not going to give you answers, right? But I will say something like, you really need to look a lot more, and there's a lot of detail that you could bring in here that you're not supplying me with. So you need to, or of course, maybe you're doing fine. All right. The last thing, and this one is important, is don't forget the class policy and your instructions and advice that were given on the midterm. Type your response in Word, cut and paste it into the text box and submit it. The class policy is that you will get a 0 if you submit a link, which some people have done recently, and they got zeros on their midterms and finals. Any of those cloud storages, Google Drive, and I understand some of the high schools may use that as their default. Just submit a link to a Google Docs. That is not acceptable, and there are a few reasons why. Number one is there's no academic integrity there. We have deadlines for a reason because it makes it fair, because everybody has the same exact chance to finish this. People with accommodations might get extra time or something of that nature, but you will basically submit this on a Tuesday. If it takes me a week to grade all of these, the people who submit links, there's nothing that stops you from going in there and adding to or changing what you have in your document. So it does not guarantee that you turned it in on time. All right. The second thing is it's a third-party link, which we technically are not supposed to click on unless we know where it comes from. Now, I can hover over it and honestly see where it comes from, but so it's not as big of an issue. But that's the reality of it is that is something to try to avoid. But please just follow the directions. So I really do not enjoy giving zeros because people send the links in. What I want is to grade your work. But I also don't have any patience for people who can't follow very simple instructions like don't send in a link. All right, so don't send in a link. All right. With that closes this one out. And again, take advantage of what you have. Watch the videos. All right. And again, I know they're not exciting. How exciting can talking about a midterm exam be? But, if they're not exciting, you get too bored, go watch 5 minutes, go do something, come back and watch another 5 minutes. Take notes from it. If you sit there, and again, I'm giving you basically a C-level response in the first recording, and then I see none of that in what you write, and you say you watched it, I know that, well, you probably did not write down what's in there. I've had a couple of people who had trouble with the quizzes. My advice was to write down everything that's in the chapter, and not everything, but write down an outline, giving you the main parts. And every single one of them came back and said, wow, I got A's on them the next time. Same thing with this. Write it down and you will remember it. Don't write it down. It will go in one ear and out the other, or through one eye and out the back of your skull, whatever. But writing is a process that helps you to retain it, which is what you want to do. And especially when it's important stuff, like what you need to include in your midterm exam. All right. With that, I'm closing it off. And again, please take use of those. I will be out of the office Tuesday and be back in on Monday. I'm sorry, not Tuesday. I will be out of the office Thursday and Friday. I will return on Monday. But if you send that to me over the weekend, or those 2 days, I will get a look at those on as soon as I can and get some at least general advice to you. It's not that difficult. Again, I'm telling you, like 90% of the people in some of my classes failed it, but that's because they did not take advantage of these sources. If you're watching this, keep in mind that pretty much everybody who watched those and did what I said about the writing it down and retaining it scored at least a B on it. So it's not hard stuff. It's that people don't put the effort into it. So do that and you will be fine. All right. Thank you and good luck on it.